and myself were two of the 4 members, along with a former colleague from Iowa and our current colleague from California, who pushed hard for the debt relief at a time when there was some resistance to it. This committee's concern and the concern of many of the members with a more effective use of the international financial institutions for the fight against poverty is a long-standing, and I do want to say this is not an opportunistic hearing. I will say, as an elected official, that I do not mean by that to denigrate opportunism as a mode of operation. I don't want to be saying something that could be used against me later. But in this case, we really had been thinking about this for some time. And it is the first in a series of hearings we're going to have about the role that the international institutions, financial institutions, can play in the war against poverty. And I think it is important to reaffirm a couple of things, namely that it is possible through thoughtful action to reduce poverty, abolish it, eliminate it. We're not in the miracle business, but it can be substantially reduced. It is also the case that I believe, and many others do, that we have existing institutions which are A, imperfect, and B, indispensable. And therefore, it is our job to do what we can to improve them without going after them in a most negative way. And I am pleased that when I first began involved with this, we had the campaign called 50 Years is Enough. Well, we now know that 60 years is too little, not in terms of duration, but in terms of activity. And there are some very important issues that we plan to deal with. On the question of the bank, there is a legitimate set of concerns now about what role the IMF should be playing as things have evolved from when it was first set up. There are problems of excessive conditionality. Many of us on the Democratic side in particular have been concerned about what appears to be a bias against the rights of workers that has crept in to some of the activity. There is a question about how you fight corruption effectively and how you fight corruption in a way that does not make people who live in corrupt countries double victims of corruption. Victims first when people steal money that was meant for them, and victims again when people then withhold any further money for them. We need to be able to sharpen that fight against corruption so we go after those who are really the problem. There is the question of the extractive industries, of the failure of mineral wealth to benefit large numbers of people the way it ought to. And all of those are things we are going to study on an ongoing basis. I have 2 minutes left in my statement, and I'm going to yield it to the gentleman from California. And then in a step that the parliamentarian tells me is okay, I'm going to give up my second 5 minutes. We have 10 each, and the ranking member and I have both agreed not to extend the time, and I appreciate that because we do have a little bit of a truncation. I'm going to offer my 5 minutes to the witnesses, divided up among them, because I don't know that all the testimony will be summarized within 5 minutes. And at this point, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Alabama. Or should I take it?
I thank the chairman. I welcome our panel, and I'm going to make my remarks very brief because if I realize anything, it's that our 4 panelists all know more about this subject than I do. So I'm going to spend my time listening. I will make one comment. Dave Beckman, who's one of the panelists, and I work very hard on debt relief, and his book, Grace at the Table, was one of the books that inspired me to become involved. And in that book, one of the questions it asks is, what will the United States and our generation be remembered for? Will it be, if we're leaders in the world, or we're to display leadership, what do we do with that leadership? What influence do we have? And I think it's becoming more and more apparent to all of us that it is in our best interest to improve the plight of people all over the world. Global poverty is a threat not only to the citizens of the poor countries, it's a threat to the rest of us too. And I'll close with this one fact. Prior to the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan, according to many of the world surveys, Afghanistan was the poorest educated country in the world. Almost none of the young women in Afghanistan had ever seen a school, and about 75% of the young men had never set foot in a classroom. And it was into this vacuum that the Taliban came. And as we know, they filled that vacuum with something that was really a threat to all freedom-loving people. When they told the Afghan people that you're not capable of educating your children, you can't afford to do it, so we will educate them. And they taught the young children in Afghanistan really a doctrine of hate. And it didn't isolate that situation to Afghanistan. It affected all of us. And throughout many parts of our world today, that same doctrine, those same forces are going into countries where there's a lack of education and infrastructure, and they're taking advantage of that. And as opposed to nothing happening in that country, those countries, what is happening in those countries is dangerous, which is actually far worse than nothing happening, is something bad happening. So I think it is definitely in not only the best interest of those countries, but in our own national security to see that those countries are stable and that they have that basic education and consequently, as we know, different rights and freedoms are respected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize for 2 minutes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The world goes gaga because one guy at the World Bank gets $195,000 for his paramour. The press ignores the fact that the World Bank is on schedule to disperse $1.3 billion to the Iranian government, a substantial portion of it being American, and that some $270 million was dispersed to the Islamic Republic during Wolfowitz's short tenure. The administration has substantial clout with the World Bank, purchased at the expense of the American taxpayer. It used it first to install Wolfowitz, then to back him as he tried to back the World Bank out of family planning, and then finally used up every bit of clout in an all-out effort to help him save his job. The administration has done nothing to try to stop the loan agreements or the disbursements. Now, it is true the administration voted against the loans. They were required to do so by law. So perhaps we should consider ourselves blessed that no one in the administration was willing to commit a crime in order to assist the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not only do these laws provide resources to the government of Iran, they also give it the good housekeeping stamp of approval. How can we convince the Iranian people that they will be cut off from the world if they continue to develop nuclear weapons when they are getting money from the World Bank, some of it ours? In addition, governments stay in power by bringing home the bacon. We know how to stay in office. That's why we're sitting up here. And it's by bringing home the bacon, even though it's not halal or kosher. The Islamic Republic is bringing home the bacon from the World Bank, part of it ours. We will go back to the floor of the House, I hope, and vote for foreign aid, as I have again and again, and hope that our constituents don't realize that a portion of that foreign aid is going to a government that is developing nuclear weapons. I yield back.
The ranking member of the Subcommittee on Domestic and International Monetary Policy, the gentleman from Texas, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of all the elements of the Bretton Woods system, perhaps the most enduring has been the World Bank and its associated institutions. Although highly regarded in some circles, the bank has been a significant failure in helping the residents of poor and developing nations. Like many bureaucracies, the World Bank has constantly attempted to reinvent itself and redefine its mission. Some critics have referred to this as mission creep. It is the reaction of self-interested bureaucrats who are intent on saving their jobs at all costs. The non-institutional elements of the Bretton Woods, such as the gold-backed dollar standard, have gone by the wayside, but the World Bank and the IMF soldier on. What is most annoying about the World Bank are the criticisms alleging that the bank and its actions demonstrate the negative side of free market capitalism. Nothing could be further from the truth. The World Bank is not an organization devoted to capitalism or to the free market, but to state-run corporate capitalism. Established and managed by a multitude of national governments, the World Bank promotes managed trade by which politically connected individuals and corporations enrich themselves at the expense of the poor and the middle class. Western governments tax their citizens to fund the World Bank, lend this money to corrupt third world dictators who abscond with the funds and then demand repayment, which is extracted through taxation from the poor third world citizens, rather than from the government officials who are responsible for the embezzlement. It is in essence a global transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Taxpayers around the world are forced to subsidize the lavish lifestyle of third world dictators and highly paid World Bank bureaucrats who don't even have to pay income taxes. The World Bank has outlived its intended purpose. Capital markets are flush with money and well developed enough to lend money not just to national governments, but to local and regional development projects at competitive market rates. In the aftermath of Mr. Wolfowitz's departure, much will be made of the question of his successor, when the questioning instead should be directed toward the phasing out of the organization. And I yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for the remaining 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. Thank witnesses in advance. While the World Bank was created with the direct mission to make loans and grant loans to low and middle income countries to reduce poverty and to promote economic development, and that is an admirable goal, one I support. Unfortunately, the World Bank has become, as many have said already, a bloated bureaucracy that is increasingly moving its focus away from its core mission. Desmond Lockman, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, states, by extending its mandate, the bank has not only lost focus of its primary goal of poverty reduction, but has also made it difficult to hold the bank accountable for its core activities. It might be in the World Bank's best interest to narrow those focus, suggesting, quote, these narrow goals might include the eradication of debilitating illnesses like malaria, feeding the hungry, and supplying clean water, end quote. Another way that I believe that the World Bank has ventured away from its original charter is by focusing too much of their resources on making loans to middle-income countries such as China and India. These countries already have access to vast amounts of private investment capital and should no longer need the World Bank help in financing infrastructure improvement. Approximately 50% of the loans they have made in 2006 went to just 5 countries, China and India including. Mr. Chairman, I believe the World Bank is an organization that is still trapped in the 20th century and has not moved forward with the times. Studies have shown that its past record shows that it is in failure in many of the countries that it has been involved with. New York University's conclusive study shows that those countries that have been the largest recipients of the World Bank loans have performed no better and oftentimes worse than those countries which did receive the bank's favor. And to make matters worse, those countries like China and India, which have ignored the bank's nostrums, comfortably outperformed those countries like Russia and Argentina, which were more receptive to the world advice, as has been stated. Finally, I do applaud the outgoing President Wolfowitz's efforts in trying to rein in the out-of-control corruption within the organization. The anti-corruption agenda has been a primary objective of this administration, but I do hope that whoever, as his successor comes in line, that he will continue to focus on this important problem. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I thank all the members for their cooperation. And we will begin with Dr. Stiglitz, and I have 5 minutes remaining, and I am going to give a minute and a quarter to each of the witnesses. So each witness will have 6 1/4 witnesses. This is useful stuff, and that may not seem like much, but it is when you start talking. So each witness will get 6 1/4 minutes. I will tell the timekeeper. Dr. Stiglitz.
Well, thank you very much for holding these hearings. And I want to agree with the sentiment that you expressed in the beginning, that America and the world has a strong interest in contributing to reducing poverty and promoting growth in the developing world. Aid can be an effective instrument in achieving these objectives. The multilateral institutions, of which the World Bank is the premier lending institution, play an important role in this global effort. For a variety of reasons, assistance administered through the World Bank and other multilateral institutions can be even more effective in achieving our objectives than assistance provided by the U.S. directly. This is especially true at the current time when American credibility, especially in the developing countries, has sunk to an all-time low. The question is the World Bank today playing the role that it should be playing, and if not, what can be done about it? Even before the recent turmoil at the institution, there was considerable concern about its direction. Large numbers of its senior people have departed in the past 2 years. The most important asset of the institution is its staff, its human capital, and it will take years to replace what has been lost. I want this afternoon, however, to focus on broader, though not totally unrelated issues: how the World Bank should conduct its business, what the development agenda should be, and what the U.S. can do to help ensure that this is brought about. It is in our interest that the World Bank remain strong, credible, and effective. The bank has rightly emphasized good governance and corruption, but the bank can only be effective if it is seen as having good governance itself. There has to be confidence that there is not corruption in the corruption agenda, that there is not a hidden political agenda with corruption in some countries being overlooked, while in other countries there is a policy of virtually zero tolerance. Finally, part of democratic values is due process. The implementation of a corruption agenda itself must conform to the highest standards. With the resignation of its president, the question is the choice of successor, and most importantly, the process by which this is done. Good governance, a commitment to basic democratic values, requires that the head of the institution be chosen in an open and transparent process. It should be the most qualified person for the job, regardless of race, gender, or nationality. It is in America's interest that the head of the institution not simply be chosen by the President of the United States. There are other important changes in the governance of the World Bank and other multilateral institutions that will increase their effectiveness. These require a careful balancing of more democratic accountability and strengthening procedural safeguards. There are reforms to the governance of the bank, the need for which the present scandal has highlighted, and I want to comment briefly on them. On the positive side, the review process showed that the board could exercise its fiduciary role even in a very difficult situation where the largest shareholder was not fully supportive, setting up a committee that included 4 members from developing and transition economies. In spite of the pressures that were brought to bear, 22 of the 24 directors concurred with the findings of the panel, and realizing that the well-being of the bank required that the president had to go, supported that action. On the negative side, it is clear that the president of the World Bank had enormous elements of discretion in making appointments and circumventing rules and suspending loan programs and directing bank programs with insufficient checks and balances in place and insufficient oversight. Some of the systems designed to provide the checks and balances are clearly flawed, with offices which might receive complaints about presidential abuses actually reporting to the president. Fears of retribution against whistleblowers or those raising complaints were not totally unfounded. The powers of the president had previously not been abused in this way, but the fact that they could be so abused, too, highlights a fundamental flaw in governance. Reform will require careful balancing. There needs to be more accountability of the World Bank, both to the board and to other stakeholders, including donor countries, but this has to be done in ways that avoid excessive politicization of the institution. The bank has created one of the most talented and qualified bureaucracies around the world. Bureaucratic procedures have been put into place to ensure, by and large, they attract and choose highly qualified applicants. But left to themselves, the bureaucratic safeguards could lead to an entrenched bureaucracy pursuing its own agenda, or insufficiently flexible to adapt to changing circumstances, including new learning about the costs and benefits of privatization and liberalization, new attitudes about country ownership, or new agenda, such as those concerning worker rights. The board, working with the president, must establish what the bank's overall agenda and priorities will be. As I argue below, this agenda must be more balanced, more consistent with our own values, and consistent with our own practices. While the bank is likely to continue to be focused on promoting growth and poverty alleviation, it is inevitable that there will be changing views on how this can most effectively be done. The board, and not just the president, must play a central role in constructing and improving this agenda, and then ensuring that the president and the staff of the bank implement that agenda in an effective and consistent way. At the same time, the checks and balances and safeguards against abuses by the president of the World Bank have to be strengthened. In the text, I provide details on how that might be done. There are problems of both internal and external governance that I discussed in the text. International economic institutions, like the World Bank, are at some distance from direct accountability. To address this problem, at least 3 actions are required. The responsibility for the World Bank should shift from Treasury to AID, or should be shared with AID. This is a practice followed by many other countries, and it is essential if the developmental perspective is to remain paramount in dealings with the World Bank. Secondly, there needs to be more parliamentary congressional oversight. The appropriate form of this oversight will need to be worked out. A committee of the parliaments and congresses, including donor and recipient countries, could be formed to review the agenda procedures and discuss widely perceived grievances. And thirdly, there needs to be more transparency, public oversight of decisions both before and after they are made. These reforms, and there are many other reforms in the governance which I have discussed elsewhere, are, I would argue, as much in the interest of the United States as they are in the interest of the world as a whole. No system is perfect. A president determined to evade the set of safeguards put into place may still be able to do so even after those are strengthened. Humans are fallible, and so are institutions that they create. I want to turn to more specific aspects of the World Bank agenda, beginning with corruption. Fighting corruption requires more than just speeches. It requires a comprehensive agenda that includes the development of policies that reduce the scope for corruption. There are ways that the U.S. and other advanced industrial countries can contribute to the fight against corruption, most notably strict enforcement of anti-bribery laws, eliminating bank secrecy, not just for terrorists, but also for tax evasion and corruption, and demanding transparency in payments to governments, for instance, by using the tax code to enforce the extractive industry's transparency initiative. Successful development requires, however, more than just attacking corruption. Aid effectiveness can be undermined not just by corruption, but by incompetence, by the absence of the appropriate complementary policies. It requires a comprehensive development agenda. There is also needs to be country ownership of the development policies, programs, and strategies. Excessive conditionality undermines this and development effectiveness. While the conditions that have been imposed have been reduced, in many cases they still remain excessive. IMF cross-conditionality is especially problematic. And even as upfront conditionality has been reduced, new forms of hidden conditionality have been introduced through the IDA allocation formulae. These formulae fail to deliver aid to where it is likely to be either most needed or most effective. The challenge to the World Bank and other aid agencies when confronting a country with poor governance is to find alternative delivery mechanisms for aid. It is bad enough that the people in these countries are suffering from poor governance. To be doubly punished by denying aid would seem unfair, especially if there exist alternative ways by which assistance can be provided, especially in health and education, investments in the youth of these countries. The problem is that the conditionalities that have been...
You'll need to sum up, please, Dr. Stiglitz.
What?
Need to sum up.
Okay. The problem is that the conditionalities that have been imposed in the past have, in some cases, actually reduced aid effectiveness. Moreover, these imposed policies represent values that are contrary to those that are held by the vast majority of Americans. The disparity between what we require of others and what we do ourselves further undermines the credibility of the institution and aid effectiveness. Thank you.
Next, Dr. Robert Hunter Wade, who is a professor of political economy at the Development Studies Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Wade.
Thank you. I want to step back from the concerns that Joe Stiglitz was talking about and address the current deep crisis of relevance that the World Bank is facing. The bank's market has changed fundamentally in the past decade, but the bank continues to operate in much the same way and with much the same products as a decade ago. The change in the bank's market was dramatically symbolized just last week when while the US and European governments were fighting over President Wolfowitz's future. At that same time, the African Development Bank held its annual meeting, not in Africa, but in Shanghai. This event will be looked back upon as a milestone in the history of the 21st century. The main message of my testimony is that the World Bank can potentially add much more value to the solution of some of the world's most urgent problems than it has been doing. And secondly, that the US Congress and the next administration can help the bank do so by signaling strong support for a revived World Bank. In the immediate future, that signal of strong support means supporting the current administration and selecting a first-rate candidate as the next president, a candidate with an excellent record as a leader and manager of a large, complex organization, that criterion would knock out some of the names on the current shortlist. And secondly, congressional support means the Congress paying over the still outstanding U.S. payments on IDA 14. Looking beyond the immediate future, the Congress should support the World Bank in taking more of a leadership role in several genuinely global areas. In its traditional products of aid projects and economic advice to governments of developing countries, the World Bank's market has changed in the sense that it now faces a whole array of new competitors, supplying much the same kinds of products, such as China and Korea, which have become big sources of financial assistance to poorer countries, such as private consulting firms, which have developed superior skills in many of the bank's traditional areas of expertise, such as banking and finance, and also such as the Gates Foundation and other private philanthropic foundations, which have become big players in this financial assistance game. But given all that, the bank still retains a big comparative advantage over these other entities, which is based on its combination of A, intergovernmental guarantees, B, its own large revenue base, and C, its global reach. This combination makes the World Bank almost unique. And in particular, I suggest that the bank should take a leading role in addressing one of the biggest specific issues of our time, which is how to get economic growth with much less by way of carbon emissions, how to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions. The bank has a lot of experience in formulating economic policies, translating them into investment plans, translating the plans into investments on the ground, and it should use this general experience to take the conclusions of reports like the IPCC reports and the Stern report, and then translate those general conclusions into what they mean for specific countries, such as China, India, Bangladesh, Brazil, and so on, and then to help those governments work out country programs focused on decoupling their economic growth from their emissions. This task, it would be a relatively new task for the bank, and it would require the bank to develop new financing instruments in order to accelerate the take-up of environmentally friendly technologies. For example, the bank could establish a carbon fund, a fund which would, for example, allow a developing country such as China or India to borrow from the bank for a power station and to choose a state-of-the-art technology for that power station, a state-of-the-art technology reduction technology, even though that technology is more expensive, but with this fund, rather than the government of the country having to bear the incremental cost. Such a fund could be used to accelerate the uptake of climate-friendly investments in the power sector, in transportation, railways for Africa, for example, in forestry and land use practices, and in still other sectors. And some of the finance for this fund could come immediately tomorrow, straight from the World Bank's current reserves. The World Bank currently has 36 billion in reserves. It needs only 25 billion in order to retain its all-important AAA credit rating. So the balance between, or much of the balance between, the 25 billion that it needs and the 36 billion in reserves that it has could go into such a climate stabilizing fund. This fund could also receive grants from OECD governments, from private foundations, and the like. So this is just one small example of how the bank could be playing a significant catalytic role in addressing international environmental issues generally and climate change in particular. To do this, to reposition itself in this way, it would have to undertake some pretty big internal changes and to develop some new streams of revenue. I leave the details of how I think the bank could do these two things to the written testimony. The bottom line of what I'm saying is that even though if we were starting afresh in 1944, we would surely not start with the present World Bank. But the present World Bank is what we have to work with. And I suggest that the present World Bank does need US support to reposition itself in order to fulfill the valuable role that it is almost uniquely able to play in the world. And just to address directly, finally, Mr. Garrett's from Texas, Mr. Paul's point about how capital markets, private capital markets, are now grown to the point where they can take care of all the tasks that the World Bank might do. I suggest that in this area of meeting these genuinely global problems, providing what economists call global public goods, capital markets, private capital markets, are not going to do the job. For that job to be met, there is plenty of scope for a multilateral public institution like the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wade. And next, Mr. David Beckman, who is the president of Bread for the World. Mr. Beckman.